He watched his son press a mud-smeared palm to the creature's fur and did not move. Everything in Tomas knew how to move, how to swing an axe to split a stubborn knot of cedar, how to lift a fallen log from a sled, how to step around a beehive without startling it. But in the instant Luca reached, the world folded into a silence so sharp, Tomas felt it like a cut. The machine of his life, the sawmill clock, the wage envelopes, the predictable ache in his shoulders, stalled. The thing beneath the boy's hand exhaled, enormous and tremulous, a sound like a river letting go of ice. Wet stone eyes blinked. Moss-shimmered fur pressed around a palm the size of Luca's whole chest, and the guardian, smaller than the legends and bleeding where a steel cable had braided into tendon, lifted one great cautious hand toward the child and let him lay a scraped yellow truck into it. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Tomas tasted iron and old wood on his tongue, and remembered a different summer when his wife's laugh had filled the back porch, and the mill had been just a place they both returned from at dusk. He remembered, too, the way his grandmother used to whisper names under her breath at the forest edge, placing bread on the roots of an oak, as if she expected it to leave a blessing in return. He had shrugged those things away when the hunger for money grew loud. He had taught Luca the creed of the sawmill: respect the work, fear the dark. He had never taught him to give toys to monsters. The grove beyond the timberline had always been a place of hush. The maples there arched like cathedral ribs. Their roots knotted into altars of stone and moss. Old maps called out names in different tongues: Omulpaduri, Pushchin, Sasquatch. Ancestral labels placed by travelers who thought they could pin a thing down with ink. The town at the forest's edge traded in a practical hunger: paychecks, grocery lists, a mortgage measured in beads of sweat. Yet myth was a ledger everyone consulted quietly when a storm threatened or a calf went missing. Superstition kept kids home on certain nights and made men cross themselves when they walked the logging roads alone. The logging company had new machinery this spring, its corporate trucks smelling of oil and certainty. They pushed the line past where Tomas had set stakes for years. Farther into the grove the townspeople whispered was holy. The company sent surveyors with polite smiles. They called meetings with coffee and brochures about sustainable yield. They promised jobs and steady wages, something Tomas had learned to trust because hunger did not leave room for metaphors. His hands remembered the swing of an axe before they remembered his wife's face. So when he signed the manifests that allowed the chainsaws to move a few paces deeper, he thought he was signing for bread. Elena Marcu arrived like a question. She wore the practical independence of someone who had learned young to carry instruments and not ask permission. Her laptop had stickers from conferences. Her boots had the stubborn shine of a person who slept with field notes in a tent. And her voice held the iron patience of someone who had spent 10 years trying to make the woodland speak in a language bureaucrats would understand. She had come to gather data: sound recordings, scat samples, motion camera stills, proof to tuck into legal petitions. The law, in Elena's reckoning, could translate wonder into protection. They were at odds in ways both blunt and intimate. Tomas viewed Elena as another kind of interloper, an academic who would not understand the mill's needs and would, with a photograph, risk the wages that fed his son. Elena saw Tomas as the visible edge of a machine that would erase the grove before her instruments had a chance to hum. Around them, the town's fear grew like mold in damp wood, seeding hysteria. Old wives muttered about curses. Young men showed off scars they claimed came from an encounter with something in the dark. The mayor called for order. A local pastor called for prayer. A few people gathered petitions for a complete cut. The night before the cable incident, the logging team left lights and fuel drums like bright teeth in the grove's mouth. Tomas lay awake on the bench beside the stove, listening to the wood settle and to the soft, brave snores of Luca. He had told himself he could pull back if it got ugly. He had told himself protections were in place. But hunger makes a man want the certainty of the ledger, numbers that mean food. Elena's presence turned certainty into a fragile, brittle thing. At dawn, the forest breathed cold and wet. Men in orange vests moved like urgent insects, running lines, rerouting a slope of birch. They unrolled cable that threaded through pulleys and around trunks. The cable was meant to drag a stubborn giant of a fir out of its rooting, but some roots were older than maps. In the middle of the morning, the cable snagged a mass of fur and sinew no one had catalogued. A young guardian, smaller and narrower in the hips than legend promised, its shoulder wrapped in braid and blood where the pulley had tightened. The thing made a sound no one there could place, a keening that turned the air into glass. Panic widened like spilled oil. Men ran. Someone shouted for their guns. Someone else hurled a whiskey bottle. A man in a vest who had spent his life in the town's bar convinced others they had been trespassed upon and that the forest had to be made safe for children and livelihoods. The mayor sent a terse message to the company. The company sent men with radios. Elena, who had been setting a camera on a tripod to capture dawn calls of the thrushes, moved forward before anyone could think to stop her, because a scientist's hunger for the truth had learned to act like a prayer. She found the thing huddled behind a slab of earth, its fur muddy, its breath ragged. Its eyes were ringed with red. It did not lunge. It watched her with the wary patience of an animal that had met too much and trusted too little. Elena reached with gloved hands to examine the braided wound, to see how deep the steel had cut, and recognized in it an old scar pattern she had seen in photos from other places where men had tried to capture or kill to study, leaving injuries that never quite healed. She thought of the child she had failed to save when she was smaller, a previous research trip that had ended in a trap. She felt, in that moment, the same hollow she had been trying to fill with data and petitions. Word left the grove and ran faster than any living thing. The town's fear curdled into a loud, ugly hunger. The guardian had to be dealt with. If it survived and people saw, the company warned, the site could be declared protected and jobs lost. If it was killed, the problem would be solved, they said. In the naked arithmetic of no-compromise men, a dead guardian meant safe lines and steady pay. Tomas heard the arguments like bullets and felt them lodge in the soft tissues where decisions are made. His son's lunch money, the rent, the mortgage, on a house that still smelled faintly of his wife's lavender. Secrets, always present, crept up in the light. The town's elders remembered a woman, Tomas's grandmother, who had walked the edge of the grove with loaves and lace, speaking to the trees in a tongue no one now used. They had called her eccentric, then old, then harmless. But the memory of her offerings implied an older covenant, a mutuality of give and take that men with chainsaws had forgotten. The memory twisted Tomas in a way his ledger could not account for. He had been small enough once to hear his grandmother's voice shaping the air. He'd learned to laugh that away in the sawdust and the oil. He had tucked the old prayers into the corner of himself like a ragged coat you only take out when the snow hits. Elena, for her part, kept a private history that she did not publish in papers. A boy she could not save in a mountain valley years ago, when she had rationalized a risk and watched a creature drown under a trap she had not noticed in time. Her first paper had been an attempt to make amends with ink, but ink had no scent and did not swell a wound. Every camera snapshot she took was a quiet atonement. Every coaxed witness a small prayer. When she saw Luca's small hand offer a toy to the guardian, something in her that had been at rest since the earlier failure stirred like a bird in a cage. The council called an emergency vote that afternoon beneath a sky the color of bruised apples. They decided to seal the grove with temporary fencing and to approve a final clear-cut beyond the fence, a symbolic compromise meant to appease both companies and the town. The company prepared heavy equipment. Men sharpened arguments like knives. The mood was fierce and tidy, as if grief could be folded into ordinances. That night, Tomas sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands and listened to his son sleep breathe through the thin house. He watched the timberline under a thumb of moonlight and felt the old knot constrict in his chest as if some animal had circled inside it. He thought of the injured guardian and of Elena's pale hands bent over its wound. He thought of his grandmother's loaves. He thought of hunger and how often it justified things men later forgot to apologize for. He felt a bone-deep tiredness and knew he would go to the mill in the morning as he always had. He could not imagine facing men who thought a chainsaw was a good sort of sermon and telling them to stop. Luca, meanwhile, dreamed of giants who were not monsters and of a forest that hummed like a summer ladder. He dreamed, too, in the small, reckless way children do, of making things right. He had done something small once, taken his grandmother's old scarf when he was 3 and wrapped it around a hunk of driftwood, calling it his bear puppet. And he remembered how it had calmed him when thunder made the house rattle. The next morning he would wake carrying more courage than sense, and something that had been only a faint possibility would become a choice. Outside, beyond the lamplit porches and the neat rows of pickets, the grove waited, breathing slow and old. Between the town's fear and the company's plans and Elena's patient dossiers, the wood held a resilience that no meeting could entirely erase. The course of what would be done still rested in the hands of stubborn, frightened people, and in the small, impossible courage of a child whose creed had always been simpler and truer than the complicated negotiations adults wrapped around their fears. The timberline bristled like a promise and like a threat. Tomas, who had learned to listen to the wood when it leaned that way, felt for the first time the real weight of a decision he had been trying to avoid. Tomas did not sleep that night. He sat with the mug cooling in his hands and felt like a man who had discovered a new rhythm in his bones, one that did not match the steady thump of saws. In the dark, the house murmured around him. The stove's hush, Luca's even breathing, the cupboard's lids settling into place. He had always relied on rhythms, payroll, sunrise, the way the mill sighed when a new log entered its hunger. And now, between those metronomes, a different kind of rhythm had set itself in his chest. It beat with the remembered cadence of his grandmother's whispered lists, the same notes she used when she placed bread at roots, names in an older language, half-sung and full of petition. He wanted to say that those names had been foolish, quaint, the last exhalation of superstition. Instead, they rose up like smoke, and he could not smother them. Morning found the town divided and loud. Men with grease-stained palms crowded around the company trucks, swapping stories like trading cards. Some said the guardian should be taken to the state line, where officials with permits could determine what it was. Others argued for immediate destruction, for safety, they called it, as if safety could be measured purely in the absence of what you feared. A cluster of mothers gathered near the schoolyard, their faces pale and hard as unbaked clay, and demanded action. They thought of children wandering where they had wandered as children, and the imagination of the forest as danger. The mayor tried to thread a middle path. He read out legals about protected species and about property rights, as if language could stitch together the torn edges of a town's conscience. Elena moved through the crowd like a calm current, her clipboard clutched to her chest. She had managed, by morning, to secure a temporary injunction from a county clerk who liked her tone more than her odds. The injunction would not stop a company with money and an urgent timeline if the town insisted on going its own way, but it gave Elena enough time to collect the kind of evidence that could weigh heavier than a mayor's speech. She took pictures, close-ups of the braided wound where steel had sunk in, stills of footprints pressed like moons into the mud, audio that caught low, languageless sounds from the grove's edge. Each file she named with the careful cruelty of someone keeping score against her own shame. Tomas stood by the trucks, a man who wanted to be somewhere else and could not step out of his own clothes. Men he had cut with in the mill nodded with the blunt familiarity of people who share labor. They assumed he would come in, sign manifests, keep the mill's wheels turning. The assumption was a kind of question whose answer they expected. Every time someone asked Tomas whether he would work the line that day, guilt inched along his spine like a centipede. He had been hungry once and known the taste of debt like a diet. He knew how it could nudge a man toward choices he would later polish into stories about survival. A few whispered about his grandmother and bent their voices around superstition as if it were merely humor. But some looked at him with something else, curiosity spliced with fear, as if he might unexpectedly remember a thing that could protect or doom them all. Luca appeared at the kitchen table with hair sticking in all directions and a scab on his knee that he would later insist was from a hero's fall. He reached for a slice of bread, but stopped when he saw his father's face. Tomas's mouth was a line. Luca's small eyes flicked to the timberline like a compass needle seeking north. He had woken early, not from fear, but from the ineffable summons of a child who imagines a world whole, unbroken by decisions he does not yet understand. Where Tomas felt the ledger, Luca felt the pull of story, of the thing he had touched and of the quiet between the trees that hummed like a tuning fork. "What'll you do?" Luca asked, simple as a boy asking whether they should bring an extra biscuit. Tomas could not answer. He thought of the injured guardian's moist, moss-fringed fur, of the way its breath had been a river letting go of ice. He thought of Elena's hands, of the town's loud hunger. He thought of the money that waited like a patient creditor at the end of his signature. He could nearly see the ledger columns, rent, food, shoes, and the razor-thin margin a single lost paycheck would carve from them. "You go to school," he said finally, and the words felt like a small betrayal even as they left him. "I'll be at the mill." Luca nodded because he trusted the world to be organized the way adults told it was. He did not know, not yet, how brittle those adult rules could be. He shouldered his backpack, grabbed a cookie his mother had wrapped for him in wax paper months ago, and left with the simplicity of a child who believes a problem answers itself at the end of the day. The grove watched them go. Between the trunks, the injured guardian lay curled like a poem with a missing line. Elena stayed close, her presence a thin barrier between it and the men who thought fear required force. She had managed to persuade a handful of townspeople to stand with her, their faces lit with defiance and worry. They formed a ring of sorts, a human shield, small and determined, against the greater appetite of machines. But for every person on that ring, there were 3 at the planning table who saw only timber value. The company superintendent, a man named Grady, who wore his decisions like cufflinks, drew a line in the dirt and called it reason. "We'll take the clearance tomorrow," he said, his voice cool as a steel blade. "We'll finish before anyone can file anything. This place is infrastructure. It's progress." "You call this progress?" Elena snapped, voice tight as a drawn wire. She had learned to use words the way others used brawn. Hers could be surgical as a scalpel, but her voice carried a plea that wanted to be a hammer. "You're wounding a creature that didn't ask to be cataloged as an obstacle to a profit margin." Grady shrugged. "Either we save jobs or we save legends. We can't have both. And you don't think there's a middle ground? Someone asked. Grady smiled like a man closing a book. Middle ground pays for itself. The argument was not just about timber. It was about what the community would trade away and what it would choose to keep. For some, the choice was easy. For others, the ledger had more weight. Tomas felt that weight like weather. He could not pretend it did not fall on him. Each time a man at the mill mentioned quotas, or a woman at the store asked when the cutting would be finished so the road might be repaved, it was as if layers of decision were being stacked around him until he couldn't see out. At noon, the mood found a new and uglier energy. A man named Harlan, who had never cultivated patience, had brought along his hunting rifle. It was a gesture that was supposed to comfort. He insisted it was for safety, but it landed like an accusation, a sharp assessment of the guardian's right to live. Someone photographed Harlan with the rifle slung low across his shoulder. Later, that image would travel through phones and rumor-laden networks, threaded with outrage and fear, until it became an emblem for both sides. Elena saw the rifle and felt something old and terrible flare inside her. The smell of metal in a communal place was electric. She moved to stand between Harlan and the grove, her body a thin, unwilling barricade. "Put that down," she said, voice low. "This isn't how human beings decide things." Harlan laughed. "And how do you suggest we decide? By letting the forest eat our jobs?" "You decide by remembering what a life is worth," she said, "by not treating it as a problem on a balance sheet." They argued until voices frayed, and then wrapped themselves in what each thought was righteousness. The town bled into factions. Those who feared myth, those who worshipped data, those who felt tethered to ancient vows they could no longer name. Elena and Tomas found themselves less as adversaries and more as parallel lifelines, both pulled by concern for what the grove would become, both hindered by the practicalities that governed everyday survival. When news vans arrived, late, a small outgrowth of the town's sudden importance, the story shifted in shape. Cameras could not easily capture the hush between trees, nor could they measure the taste of a person's shame. Yet the cameras caught faces, the guardian's hand, the braid of steel in its flesh, Elena's hands stained with mud, Harlan's rifle half-dropped as he argued with himself on camera. The footage sped away as if to conclude a larger argument. People would see and judge and rally. A clip from a phone, Luca placing the yellow truck into the guardian's palm, had already been shared by an onlooker who had not expected what it would become. The image of the child and the creature moved faster than anything else that day, ferrying with it wonder, accusation, and a sudden, painful tenderness. Tomas watched that clip on his brother's phone in a dim corner of the mill office and felt something crack, open, like the skin of a preserved jar. He wanted to close the file, to fold the world back into manageable pieces, but he could not. The picture of Luca's small hand on the guardian's massive palm was a truth he could not unsee. It was a reckoning with his grandmother's offerings and with the ledger he had always trusted. Elena, meanwhile, scoured legal angles and old environmental statutes with the single-mindedness of someone hunting absolution. She contacted a conservation attorney whose patience had been bought with smaller victories. They drafted papers, filled forms, argued for a pause. Every box checked felt like a small stitch in a wound that no one had authorized them to fix. But law is slow, and timber companies have their own rhythms. The town was a pressure cooker now. Hungry men, frightened mothers, a mayor trying to be reasonable while bargaining his own re-election, and a small child whose single act had reframed everything. Fear and hope moved through the crowd in equal measure, two creatures with overlapping territories. As afternoon bled into a sky the color of old newspapers, Tomas made a choice that felt less like a decision than like falling. He could not, he realized, stand by and allow the ledger to be the only god in the room. He could not bear, if asked, to explain to Luca why a man had chosen pay over the courage his son had shown. He did not know how to be anything other than a practical man, but he also did not know how to live with a kind of cowardice that would ruin the small miracle his son had made. He stepped out of the mill office like a man moving to his own funeral and walked toward the grove. Each step was a small revolution. The people who saw him pass whispered, some with suspicion, some with a budding reverence. Elena, who had been hunched over a tangle of legality in her truck, saw him coming and felt something like relief and terror in equal measure. She had wanted witnesses. She had not known how badly she needed an ally with calloused hands and the authority of a man the town listened to. Tomas did not know how to speak in the language of petitions and law. He did know how to put his body where his choices were required. As he approached, the guardian lifted its head a fraction. Its eyes found him, and in that small meeting something unwound that had been tight in both of them. Tomas did not have the words his grandmother had used. He had instead the slow, honest apology of a man who had taught his son to fear the dark and now needed to tell the dark he had been wrong. He removed his work gloves and, with a tremulous steadiness, knelt at a respectful distance. He did not reach to touch the creature. He bowed his head, awkward and reverent. In a town crowded with opinions, his act was simple and foreign and charged with an old, raw thing, contrition. "You were right," he said, voice a crack in a log. "I was wrong." The guardian exhaled, and for the first time in many days, the forest answered a human voice with something like curiosity instead of immediate grief. Elena watched, clipboard forgotten, and felt the long-held breath she had been keeping for years begin to ease. Around them, people shifted, as if the air had changed its weight. The day's fights were not decided in that single moment, but the possibility of another way, one where agreement could live with obligation, had been opened. The timberline, which had been a sharp divide between jobs and myth, twitched, like the thin skin of an agreement not yet settled. Men argued on porches and prayed in churches. Elena and Tomas found themselves, unwillingly and profoundly, tied to one another by the fragile thread of what they had seen and by who had the power to make other people listen. The push and pull of the town would continue. The next choices would be louder and more costly. But for a brief, fierce span, the story had swung away from hunger and toward mercy, and someone's child had taught them what that could look like. Night fell like a curtain. The grove turned black and full of breathing things. Tomas went home with his hands empty and his heart oddly full, aware that the next day would demand more than a statement. He had offered an apology with his voice. He knew now he would have to offer more with his deeds. Elena packed her devices and files into a battered case, resolving to make every data point count as evidence and not as trophies. Luca dreamed on, his small chest rising and falling without the burden men carried at their cores. Outside, the grove kept its own counsel. Between the town's fear and the company's plans, it held a soft, dangerous mercy, and in that mercy, the next act of this fragile reconciliation would be written, messy, human, and as treacherous as any place where old promises meet modern hunger. The next morning, the town woke with a jagged edge, as if the night had been sawed through and someone had left the raw fiber exposed. News vans slept in muddy ruts, their logos blinking like small, unnatural moons. The company trucks revved with a certainty that irritated the air. People gathered in clusters, their words clanging against one another like metal on metal. Tomas woke with the taste of apology on his tongue and a fatigue he could not lay aside. He found at once that apologies made a very poor kind of armor. Word traveled in half-truths and whole fears. Someone at the diner had heard that the guardian's kind had a name in the old language, a name that meant root keeper and promised retribution. A woman at the post office whispered that her great-uncle's herd had been saved once by leaving a calf at the root of the grove. It was rumor braided with memory. And where memory and rumor met, a strange new currency formed: guilt. People who had never knelt before a tree found themselves standing with head bowed, as if ritual shyly re-entered their lives because the ledger had become suddenly painfully insufficient. Elena moved through the scene like someone trying to name a new color. She had the injunction in her pocket and a new, sharper urgency in her bones. Her camera battery hummed like a small, obedient animal. Her recorder had finally captured that low, unplaceable sound the protectors made in the wood, a sound older than speech. She had proof that might sway courts, but courts moved with the stately slowness of glaciers, and timber moved with the appetite of tides. Evidence could keep a thing alive on paper, but it could not staunch a wound in time. "I need footage of the wound," she told the attorney on the phone, her voice taut. "I need interviews. I need local testimony, someone who remembers the old giving." She paused and then added something private she did not have to say aloud, but which steadied the call. "And I need a credible local witness to stand with us, someone they listen to." On the other end was a man who had defended wetlands and old growth in courts that smelled of lemon oil and impatience. "Find me a name they can't scoff at," he said. "A farmer, a pastor, a mill hand, someone they respect. Then we'll file for an emergency preserving order. But Alina, listen, the company will fight. They have permits and cash." Elena looked up from where she stood at the grove's edge. Tomas was speaking to the mayor in clipped tones, his hands in his pockets, his jaw set like a nailed plank. He had the look of someone who had walked a long way to arrive at a short truth. When his eyes found hers, there was no longer distance to create. He walked toward her with that clumsy authority men like him had in town, blunt, unavoidable. The attorney had asked for a credible witness, and Tomas had become, in the space of a day, both a threat and a promise. "You have my voice," Tomas said without fanfare, "not because I'm clever enough to see the law's teeth, but because I know what my boy saw." His hands were calloused in a way that made his sincerity heavier. Elena wanted to thank him until her throat dried. What she said instead was small and formal, the way a scientist will sometimes speak to kindness as if it were a specimen. "We'll need you to testify that you saw the creature and that you recognize the grove as something that shouldn't be erased." He nodded. "I'll say what I saw. He stopped because the thing between his teeth was complicated. It had all the angles of a confession. "I'll sign where you need me to sign." A camera operator from a local station hovered, sensing the human note that made his footage more valuable. He pressed close and asked the questions everyone else wanted printed. Would Tomas stand in front of the chainsaws? Had he always believed the stories? Would he sacrifice his job to protect a myth? Tomas answered, in a voice that surprised even him, with an understatement that was almost a prayer. "I'll stand," he said. "I will stand." That declaration shifted the field. Men at the mill bristled like animals scenting a storm. Some called Tomas a fool in the privacy of truck cabs. Others, embarrassed by their own hesitation, avoided his glance. Harlan, the man with the rifle, watched from a distance like a judge keeping time. In the evening, a group of men met in the back room of a bar and called themselves the Protectors. They were not gentlemen. They had children who needed school books and mothers who feared monsters. The idea of a creature beyond human law frightened them almost as much as the law itself. Their fear sharpened into a plan. Secrets, like water under ice, found fractures and forced them wider. Tomas's brother, Marius, who worked the mill as a foreman, had never told Tomas that he had signed extra manifests in the company's favor, not because he wanted to betray his family, but because the mortgage required a steadier number than Tomas had managed that month. When the protectors decided that a show of force was necessary to ensure the cutting went on schedule, Marius found himself at the center of a cruel arithmetic. Staying loyal to his brother meant risking his home. Turning away meant betraying a child's small act of mercy. He told himself that loyalty to family had lines. He also told himself the company would help if he kept his head down. The fractures went deeper than money. The pastor announced a prayer vigil at the grove that evening and invited townsfolk to come and ask forgiveness on behalf of the town. It would have been a chance to fold old rituals into new ones, to knit fear into a fabric of shared supplication. But the pastor had been right of late, and his pews had grown thinner. Those who came to the vigil were not numerous, but they were fierce in their need. They wanted the forest made docile. They wanted to whisper that the world could be mended by words alone. Their prayers sounded, to some, like acquiescence. At the same time, an old woman named Anna, who kept her dead husband's fishing boat at the end of a creek, began to tell a story in a careful voice that had weight, an inherited tale her grandmother had passed down. She spoke of offerings and of how the forest had once been generous to their people when they remembered to give. The tale had the tenor of a parable, and people who listened felt their edges soften. Not everyone believed Anna, but her narrative was a crucial thing. It was a reminder that the town had not always been at war with the grove. It meant nothing to the permits, but it meant much to jurors and to the many ordinary people whose votes and small daily choices would decide whether someone like Thomas would keep his job. Underneath all the public shouts and legal maneuvers, Elena uncovered another truth she had not expected. While downloading footage from a motion camera tucked into a sapling, she noticed a pattern in the creature's movement. An intelligence that organized around the river's old course, not just the grove. The guardians were not random protectors. They were a network that had long managed the forest's fragile equilibriums. The cable had been laid across a living seam. The realization widened Elena's chest with both dread and purpose. If the company's plans went through, it would not harm a lone creature. It would sever a system older than their maps. That made her work more urgent and the stakes darker. This was not only about saving a wounded animal, but about preserving a living fabric upon which the town itself depended in ways it had forgotten. The fractures became intimate and painful. Tomas's father, a man who had taught Tomas to swing an axe and had been a friend to the mill for decades, came to the grove and asked his son to think of lineage not as a chain, but as a choice. He was a man of simple theology. Work hard, feed your people. But he also remembered his wife's stories about the old loaves left under trees. He told Tomas that some debts could not be repaid with money. The conversation ended with a silence that rang with unspoken histories, of land leases made by men who had not asked the forest what it needed, of children born into houses paid for with timber that once had roots older than their foundations. Harlan's group did not wait to be denied. One moonless night, they crept with backpacks and a stubbornness sharpened by fear and sense of entitlement. They intended to set traps, to scare the creatures away, to break their will. Harlan, when he arrived at the center of the grove, found instead of a battle, a human tableau. Elena with a flashlight, Tomas beside her, a couple of older women murmuring, and a boy, Luca, who had slipped away from school and who stood between men and myth like a small lighthouse. The sight made Harlan falter. A child was not a justification for a rifle. The protector's plan began to unravel at the sight of a simple, unarmored thing that demanded mercy more than victory. But repair is harder than rupture. The image of Harlan and his rifle, of men who had counted themselves stewards suddenly brandishing weapons, had spread like an unplanned stain. The town's divisions hardened into lines. Old relationships snapped. Tomas's brother Marius avoided him, ashamed and afraid, and the distance between them cut like a new wound. The mayor's office received threats from both sides. Elena's inbox filled with demands and gratitude and curses. Anna's stories were debated on radio shows and in kitchen chairs. People were asking, in small and awful ways, what the town would become. A place that remembered how to give, or a place that paid down its debts by severing what had sustained it. Luca, central and unassuming, continued to come to the grove. He would not be stopped by adult indecision. He would sit at the edge of the injured guardian and read aloud from a ragged picture book, as though stories could stitch skin the way a butterfly stitches wings. The creature would watch, and some days it would place its great hand near the boy as if for warmth, and on other days it withdrew like a tide. The reciprocation was tiny and not enough to heal what had been cut, but it was legible as hope, an acceptance of the smallest kindness. And yet even that exchange could not live in a vacuum. The camera of the local news had caught a close-up of Luca's yellow truck lodged clumsily in the guardian's palm. It had become the emblem for both mercy and recklessness. People argued over whether the child had been brave or foolish. Some called for Luca to be kept away for his own safety. Others believed his act had been a kind of translation between two languages no one else remembered how to speak. Tomas protected his son the way men with rough hands do, by trying to make himself both shield and example. But in the private hollow of his chest, he felt the truth like a splinter. He had taught his son to fear. Now he had to learn to teach him courage. By the time the county attorney arrived, the town had shifted into a new shape of tension. There were petitions and pictures and older women telling old stories at kitchen tables. There were men huddled with rifles and men who felt suddenly very small when faced with an animal's cool, old eyes. There were legal inches to be gained and moral miles that no one knew how to measure. The grove, patient as a stone, continued its silence and its breath. In that hush, the fractures of the town showed like thin cracks in a well-used bowl. Some would eventually be glued. Others would be ground down and forgotten. Secrets had been pulled from the undergrowth and shown to the light. Relationships that had been casual were now tests of loyalty. Men who had shared beers now stared with suspicion. The town's geometry had altered. Elena and Tomas found, amid the strain, that their alliance had become a fragile, crucial thing, bound by the needs of law and the ache of regret. But alliances, like ropes, can fray. The next day would ask for more than a witness statement. It would require sacrifice, compromise, and a willingness to lose certain comforts for the sake of something older and less counted. The grove held, as if waiting, knowing that humans were complicated and slow. It was patience, in a way, that terrifies and humbles the hurried. It kept its counsel and its threat, and in doing so, it forced the town to reveal who they would choose to be when myths demanded action, and when the ledger asked to be balanced. They came like a rumor that had grown teeth. The protectors crept into the grove under the pall of a cloudless night. Boots soft on leaf mold, lamps swallowed by trunks. Harlan's rifle was a promise and a threat. His men were steadied by beer and certainty. They planned traps and ropes, a quick strike to frighten the guardians into retreat. They meant to make fear do the work the law could not. They did not expect a line of human bodies to be waiting for them. Tomas at the front, dirt under his fingernails. Elena at his shoulder, with a bandolier of flash drives and legal documents. Anna and two other elders whispering old names as if knitting an invisible net. They came like a rumor that had grown teeth. The protectors crept into the grove under the pall of a cloudless night. Boots soft on leaf mold, lamps swallowed by trunks. Harlan's rifle was a promise and a threat. His men were steadied by beer and certainty. They planned traps and ropes, a quick strike to frighten the guardians into retreat. They meant to make fear do the work the law could not. They did not expect a line of human bodies to be waiting for them. Tomas at the front, dirt under his fingernails. Elena at his shoulder, with a bandolier, flash drives, and legal documents. Anna and two other elders whispering old names as if knitting an invisible net. Luca stood behind them with his small chest up, hands clenched on the strap of his backpack, the yellow truck in his pocket like a talisman. "What the hell is this?" Harlan hissed, when the cone of his lamp hit the circle of people. He had the high, ugly certainty of someone who thought the world owed him safety. "You can't just—" Tomas didn't answer with words. He stepped forward until he was between the men and the grove. There was nothing grand in his posture, no polished rhetoric, no broad theatricality. But there was a centeredness that had been unknown to him until hunger had been made a poor excuse. "We're not letting you put steel where it'll bleed the earth," he said. His voice was not loud. It was a kind of fact. That small defiance was enough to make a man with a rifle nervous. Harlan's finger twitched. A shot, whether meant or accidental, would have split the night and ended more than a debate. Things might have turned ugly there in the black, but Elena moved with a speed that belonged to a woman who had learned how to convert shame into action. She crossed the thin space between Tomas and Harlan and put her hand on the barrel of the rifle, like a bishop laying a palm on a wound. Her other hand found his shoulder, steadying herself. "Put it down, Harlan," she said, and the words were no longer a plea so much as a calendar of consequences. She looked him square in the face. "You'll be on record shooting at people. For what? Jobs you can't keep by killing a system that feeds you? Think." For a moment, Harlan's resolve flickered. The men behind him shifted, uncertain, mouths dry. In that breath, framed by the hush of trees and the thud of a distant river, Tomas saw something like fear break open and reveal a tiredness that mirrored his own. The leader's jaw worked. He lowered the rifle an inch, then another, like a man unspooling a rope. Then someone from his circle, too young and too eager, moved to set a trap. Elena's head turned, and she shouted, a raw thing that split the night. "No!" The whistle of a bullet sang as bright as a bell. It struck bucket metal, and then, in a terrible, accidental arithmetic, Tomas put his arm up. The shock was the color of old blood. Heat rolled along his forearm and down to his chest. Luca's cry was a small, sharp animal sound. There was an awful, slow comprehension. A man had chosen to take the wound so a child could keep a wonder. Tomas staggered, then fell to his knees, breath blowing ragged in the damp air. He tasted copper and saw Elena, move like water, hands on him, fingers urgent and competent. She found the hole in his shirt, the trickle of red that wanted to tell every ledger in a town why choices cost. Her face, in that crude flashlight, narrowed and softened in a way Tomas had never seen. She knelt, sleeves rolled, the scientist's carefulness braided with something raw, fear for the man at her feet. "Hold on," she said, as if speaking to a paper she could not yet file. She tore a strip of her jacket and pressed it to the wound. Her hands were steady and fast, the way someone's hands are when they have learned to both save and atone. She called for Jake, the lawyer, with a steady step, who fumbled a first aid kit like someone learning to breathe. Luca leaped forward and was stopped by Anna's hand. The yellow truck slid from the boy's pocket. He wanted to give it, to trade it, to barter for his father's life. He had seen the ledger flip its back and reveal a shelf of priorities suddenly real and fragile. But Anna held him in a hard, soft grip and whispered a story into his hair about root keepers and small curations, and the boy obeyed like a child and not a hero. The protectors froze as a new script wrote itself. Harlan's face, normally hard with conviction, bowed with the weight of what his rifle had almost done. The trap that had been set in the dark was forgotten like a bad dream. Men shifted away from the grove's edge as if the trees had eyes and were watching how human beings decided to behave. Tomas's breathing came in terrible, measured pulls. Elena leaned over him and said things that were not papers and not petitions, but instead close and necessary. "You did what you had to," she told him, but it sounded like an accusation and a benediction at once, because truth is often both. "You didn't think about the ledger. You thought about Luca." He laughed once, a small fish of joy in a sea of pain. "I always thought about Luca," he said. The words were ragged. Just not this way. The ambulance that had been called earlier arrived with sirens that made the night flinch. Men from both sides hovered like children watching grown-ups act like rulers. In the back of the ambulance, Elena kept her hands on Tomas's, not letting a doctor erase the human contact. She watched the trail of his blood under the lights, and her face was a map of decisions she'd already made. In the woofed, quiet bones of her chest, something shifted from atonement into something warmer, a gratefulness that smelled like relief and fear, and a sudden, impossible desire. "You could have let him die out here," she said later, voice small and clear in the fluorescent hum of the ER. It was a rebuke and an admission that she knew the answer. She would not have let it be so. "And you could have let those men fire," he answered, eyes half closed, voice rough as sawdust. "You stepped in. That's a debt I don't know how to pay." "You pay me by living," she said. The sentence was more tender than either expected. The hospital night conspired to shrink the world into a room where two people met at the seam of grief and repair, and found, miraculously, a lever. They did not know then if Tomas would be out of work that week. They did not know how the county would rule. They did not know if the guild of men who worked with saws would forgive a choice that had cost a paycheck. What they did know, in the press of antiseptic and the small, honest light of the infirmary, was that the wound had made a different kind of space for them. Elena's hand stayed in Tomas's, fingers laced in a practice that had nothing to do with field notes. He blinked at her like someone waking to a new day, and, in the sprawl of midnight, kissed her because the world had pillars that needed mending, and because he wanted to promise, with a human mouth, to try. The cameras caught the ambulance leaving. They did not, could not, fully capture the rawness of a man who would gladly trade wages to keep a child's wonder. But phones did not have to. The footage that spread the next day, Tomas's arm around Elena on a hospital cot, Luca asleep on a chair with his truck clenched in his fist, became something like a witness. It reframed the ledger for those who saw it, not as a scorecard, but as a choice. In court a week later, Tomas's bandaged arm banded with the small authority of sacrifice. He testified with a voice made hoarse by the truth of having been shot for mercy. Elena presented footage, maps, and the web of guardians whose routes the company had threatened. The county clerk signed an emergency preservation order, citing public safety and ecological concern, and the extraordinary human testimony of a man who had put himself between a rifle and a myth. The company appealed. There were threats and promises in equal measure. Men who had fought the grove for months came together and, in the quiet, re-examined the cost of a cleared land. Water tables dropped, fish runs dwindled, soils that once held someone's pasture turned thin and hungry. A few foremen resigned rather than be complicit. Marius wrote Tomas a letter he did not have the courage to deliver in person. It was full of apologies and fear, and the small arithmetic of a man who had chosen survival and regretted its cost. Healing in the grove took time. The guardian's wound knit slowly around Elena's careful dressings and the whispered offerings Anna and a few others left each dawn. Luca visited with picture books and bread, and the creature learned to accept both in its great hand. Elena's research found allies in a conservation group that had the money to fight a long legal battle, and the town found, awkwardly, that protecting what had protected them was not merely a quaint morality, but a practical investment. Between Elena and Tomas, a fragile tenderness weaved itself. Two people bonded by an act that had been more sacrament than strategy. They walked the lumber road together, not as lovers yet claimed by easy labels, but as people who had seen one another in the raw and decided to keep seeing. There were arguments about priorities, about risk, but there was also laughter that tasted like wood smoke and shared coffee. They learned, together, the gentle, radical practice of choosing mercy over ledger, story over convenience. At the grove's edge, where the timberline held like a remembered throat, the guardians watched as if approving a slow reconciliation. The town, splintered and reshaped, began to stitch itself in small, awkward ways. Donations to families who had lost work, a cooperative to harvest only certain deadfall rather than living giants, a revived practice of offerings that some attended with skepticism and others with reverence. The law did not solve everything. It bought time and a different kind of conversation. Tomas's scar faded into a pale map on his forearm, a permanent ledger none of his signatures could erase. Elena's papers became a steady drumbeat in the courts. Luca's yellow truck spent long afternoons in the creature's palm like a small, stubborn flag. And between the man who swung axes and the woman who catalogued wonder, something resembling love leaned in, cautious and fierce, promising to defend what was fragile and to learn, finally, the older names of the world. The town learned, slowly and stubbornly, to keep two truths at once, that hunger was real and that some debts could not be paid with timber. The preservation order held long enough for a larger fight to begin, lawyers and funders, petitions and interviews. But it also made room for quieter work, seedlings planted where stumps had been felled, old farmers teaching boys not to drive tractors across spring runs, and a rotating rota of people who left bread and seed at the grove's outer roots, awkward rituals relearned as if by muscle memory. The mill trimmed lines, rehired some men at reduced hours, and opened a small fund for families who lost shifts. It was not generous, but it was a start. Marius sent Tomas an envelope with cash and a note that said only, "I was wrong. Meet me at the creek." Elena's injunction became the scaffolding of a campaign, her footage and maps folded into grant applications that bought time and attention. Conservationists came with expertise and patience. The county clerk, moved by a man who'd risked blood for mercy, extended protections until a full hearing could be scheduled. The Guardians network Elena had mapped began to look less like myth and more like a living infrastructure that, if honored, would sustain both forest and town. Scientists and elders testified side by side, Anna with her old tale, Elena with her recordings, and the courtroom listened in a way it had not listened to bred at roots. Between hearings and community meetings, Tomas and Elena learned the slow language of repair. They argued about tactics and budgets and whether Luca should be shielded from cameras. They also cooked soup for Anna, repaired a fence, and held a child whose small courage had bent the world. Their nights were less urgent than the first hospital vigil, but every touch carried an aftertaste of fear and a steadier promise. Tomas taught Elena to whittle, patient as if an axe could be a prayer. Elena showed Thomas how a photograph could be a kind of witness. Luca grew into his role with the easy confidence of someone who had seen kindness returned. He sat cross-legged at the grove and read to the guardian, voice loud and certain, and the creature learned the cadence of his small songs. Children in town followed his lead. What had once been fear of the dark turned into scheduled visits and carefully supervised offerings. Harlan, chastened and haunted, volunteered at the cooperative that monitored trails. The rifle he had carried was sold and the money donated to a fund for displaced families. Not everyone forgave quickly, but work shaped apologies into something tangible. The wound in the guardian healed, stitched by Elena's bandages and Luca's bread and the town's awkward offerings. When leaves unfurled the following spring, the grove smelled less like mourning and more like an economy that kept care in its ledger. On the day the hearing closed, an imperfect victory that bought the grove a protective easement and required the company to conserve certain corridors, Tomas stood at the timberline with his son and Elena beside him. The guardian came forward, whole enough to bow its great head, and Luca climbed a mossy root to press his yellow truck into its palm as if returning alone. Tomas slipped his hand into Elena's without thinking. She laced her fingers through his with a softness that was not a surrender, but a pact. The timberline held like a seam stitched with new hands. As twilight spilled across maples and fir, the guardians settled like old kings returning to their thrones, and the town's lights blinked on one by one, small beacons in a place that had learned, at last, to measure profit not only in dollars, but in the lives that made the land worth keeping.